She was the internet's rising star, a dancer whose talent and charm captivated millions. From her electrifying performances to her motivational messages, Shaniyah Porter had built a brand, a following, and a life that many would envy. Her fans saw her as an inspiration, someone who could make anything seem possible with the power of a smile and a single dance move. But behind the lights, behind the perfectly curated social media posts, there was a story that would shock them all. A story that began with a simple Uber ride, a ride that would turn Shaniyah's dream into a nightmare. How does an innocent night out end in horror? What happens when the people we trust the most, those meant to get us home safely, become the monsters we fear? The answer to that question begins in the darkness of a city street, where a life was lost and a nightmare began. Before we dive into this harrowing case, like this video and subscribe for more chilling stories of trust, betrayal, and unimaginable crimes. Shaniyah Porter was a 24-year-old dancer and social media influencer who had captured the hearts of millions. Known for her high-energy routines that seamlessly blended hip-hop and contemporary dance, Shaniyah quickly became a force to be reckoned with in the entertainment world. Her ability to connect with her audience through every movement, every beat, made her not just a performer, but a symbol of self-love and empowerment. She had a way of inspiring her fans, particularly young women, to chase their dreams and embrace who they were, no matter the obstacles in their path. Her Instagram and TikTok accounts were filled with videos of her flawless routines, her smile lighting up every frame. Behind the perfect posts and glitzy performances, however, was a young woman working tirelessly to carve out a name for herself in an industry that often chewed people up and spit them out. Shaniyah was on the rise. Her star was shining brighter by the day, with brand deals, collaborations, and the constant adoration of her fans fueling her sense of purpose. She was an icon in the making, a beacon of confidence, beauty, and determination. Holloway's life had been shaped by a series of bitter lessons, each one reinforcing his growing sense of isolation and anger. Raised in a broken home, his upbringing was marked by neglect and emotional turmoil. His mother, a hard-working woman trying to keep the family afloat, was often absent, while his father, a man whose expectations of masculinity were rigid and unforgiving, taught him early on that women were to be seen, but not heard, submissive and deferential to the men around them. It was in this environment that Dee learned the painful truth that women were the gatekeepers of his happiness and self-worth, and that their attention was something he had to earn, though no matter what he did, it always seemed just out of reach. From a young age, Dee struggled with rejection. He wasn't the kind of man who stood out in a crowd. He wasn't charismatic or socially adept, and he found himself constantly passed over by the women he longed for. These early rejections took root in his psyche, feeding into an ever-growing resentment toward the opposite sex. He blamed women for his failures, convinced that if they had given him a chance, his life would have turned out differently. But instead, he remained invisible, unnoticed, unimportant. The pain of this rejection turned into something darker, a bitterness that refused to fade. As Dee grew older, his resentment hardened into rage. He watched women in the world around him, on the streets, in the clubs, at his job, living lives he felt excluded from, and it gnawed at him. Every time he saw a woman smile at a man or give attention to someone else, it stoked the fire of his anger. The more he drove late-night passengers in his Uber, the more he felt trapped in the quiet bubble of his own existence, a man caught in the shadows while others basked in the light. The passengers he ferried from one place to another seemed to be leading lives filled with connection, excitement, and meaning, while he felt like a background character in his own story. Each ride was a reminder of the life he could never have, each conversation a further affirmation of his own insignificance. But there were moments, fleeting as they were, when Dee felt a sense of power. His job as an Uber driver gave him the illusion of control, of choice. He could decide who got in and who stayed out, who would be his passenger and who would walk away. It wasn't much, but in his mind, it was enough. In the anonymity of driving strangers, Dee could shape his world, even if just for a few minutes. Yet, despite the semblance of control, there was an underlying frustration that never left him. His resentment festered in silence, building up over time as he continued to exist in the background of other people's stories. The night Dee picked up Shaniyah Porter, he saw something he had never seen before, an opportunity. She was everything he had dreamed of and despised. The attention she garnered, the admiration that seemed to follow her wherever she went, stung him. She was confident, successful, and beautiful, everything that had eluded him his whole life. And yet, in that moment, she was just another passenger in his car, just another person who had no idea who he was or what he had suffered. But for Dee, that didn't matter. It wasn't about who she was, it was about the fact that she had something he didn't. And more importantly, she didn't seem to care about people like him. To her, he was nothing. Just another man who had no claim to her attention, to her world. In the quiet of his car, as he drove her through the darkened streets, Dee began to imagine a different kind of connection, one where he was no longer the invisible man, the ignored one. He started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this night could be different. Maybe this woman, the woman who had everything he could never have, would finally see him, acknowledge him, give him the validation he had so longed for. But as the night wore on, Dee's thoughts grew darker. The fantasy of a shared connection with Shaniyah turned into something much more sinister. The resentment that had been building in him for years suddenly found a focus, an object. In his mind, Shaniyah became a symbol of everything that had rejected him, of every woman who had ever dismissed him as invisible. His desire to have her attention, to possess her in some way, morphed into an obsessive need. And when she walked away from the ride, when she reached her destination and disappeared into the night, Dee felt a sense of loss that twisted inside him. But it wasn't just loss that Dee felt. It was betrayal. Betrayal by a world that had always overlooked him, never given him the recognition he thought he deserved. And in that moment, in the dark silence of his car, Dee knew that this was his chance, his only chance, to finally make someone see him, to take control of the one thing he felt he had the right to claim. He wasn't going to let it slip away, not this time. For Dee Holloway, the ride with Shaniyah Porter wasn't just another job. It was the beginning of something much darker, a path he couldn't turn back from. The festering resentment, the pain of years of rejection, all came to a head in that brief, fleeting moment when Shaniyah became the target of his rage. The darkness inside him, long buried and ignored, had finally found an outlet. And in that moment, Dee made a decision that would change everything. Shaniyah's night had been a whirlwind of excitement, adrenaline, and the joy of performing. As she left the club after her latest show, she felt a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. Her body ached from the high-energy routine, but the crowd's applause still echoed in her mind. She just wanted to get home, take a hot shower, and relax, away from the spotlight. With her phone in hand, she ordered an Uber, not giving much thought to the man who would be behind the wheel. The car pulled up, and she slid into the back seat, barely glancing at the driver. Dee Holloway, the 31-year-old Uber driver, watched her through the rearview mirror. She was stunning, a vision of confidence and energy, her face glowing in the dim light from her phone. He couldn't help but feel an overpowering sense of envy and resentment as she settled into the seat. Women like her, the confident, radiant ones, had always dismissed him, overlooked him, and he felt the sting of it now more than ever. He tried to start a conversation, asking her how her night went, but Shaniyah barely looked up from her phone. It was good, she answered distractedly, her fingers tapping at the screen. Dee pushed a little harder, trying to make some connection, but the more he spoke, the more she seemed to retreat into her phone. Her responses were short, unengaged, and every time she glanced at him in the rearview mirror, it was with a look of mild indifference. Must have been a crazy show tonight, huh? He ventured again, his voice laced with an eagerness he couldn't hide. Shaniyah glanced at him for a brief second before returning her gaze to her phone. Yeah, it was fine, she said flatly, her attention already back on the notifications lighting up her screen. She gave him a polite but dismissive smile, the kind you give a stranger when you're not interested in conversation. Dee's frustration began to build. She wasn't even trying. He had been nothing but polite, but she treated him like he was invisible. It wasn't the first time he had been brushed off by a woman, but something about this particular woman, this dancer with thousands of followers, ignited something in him. She wasn't just another woman, she was someone who had the kind of life he'd never get to experience. Someone who could have anyone, but who chose to ignore someone like him. Don't you think it's a little rude not to at least engage? Dee said, his voice tight with barely contained irritation. Shaniyah finally looked up, a little surprised by the shift in his tone. I'm just tired, okay? Long night, she explained, her voice soft but firm, as if she was trying to defuse any tension. Dee's mind raced. He had tried to be friendly, but she had rejected him again. She wasn't just indifferent, she was brushing him off like he didn't even matter. He could feel the simmering rage building inside of him. He wasn't just some faceless driver to be tolerated, he was a person, a man, and she had to acknowledge him, had to give him more than this casual disregard. But Shaniyah wasn't giving him the attention he craved, and it was infuriating. When she finally set her phone down, Dee saw his opportunity. He made an offhand comment about how she must have men constantly hitting on her, hoping to catch her attention. Shaniyah, perhaps a little more aware of his discomfort now, smiled politely but didn't say anything. The tension between them grew thicker as the minutes passed in silence, her indifference gnawing at him. Then, Dee, his thoughts clouded by the sting of rejection, decided to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't going to be ignored. Not anymore. Without warning, he turned the steering wheel, sharply veering down an industrial side road. Shaniyah, still unaware of the danger, looked up, startled. "This isn't the way," she said, her voice tinged with concern. Dee didn't answer. "Shortcut," he muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. He could feel his heartbeat speeding up, the anger coursing through him like a wildfire. "Hey, where are we going?" Shaniyah asked, now more urgently. She was starting to realize something was wrong. She glanced nervously at the empty, dark road stretching out in front of them. Dee didn't reply. He just sped up, keeping his eyes locked on the road ahead. His mind was swirling with rage, and all he could think about was making her notice him, making her understand the power he had. She had ignored him for too long, and now, she was going to pay attention. Shaniyah tried to grab her phone, but Dee was faster, snatching it out of her hands before she could even get a good grip on it. She gasped, her heart racing now, fear creeping into her voice. "Give it back," she demanded, her voice shaky. "No," Dee muttered darkly, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror as he noticed the panic spreading across her face. "You think you're better than me, huh? Too good for men like me." Shaniyah's eyes widened, her stomach churning. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Dee's grip tightened on the wheel, his hands now trembling with a mix of fear and fury. He ignored her questions, focused only on the anger and humiliation he had carried for so long. She had rejected him, dismissed him, and now she was going to learn what it meant to be noticed by him. When she reached for the door, Dee's hand shot out, locking it with a harsh click. The sound echoed through the car, and Shaniyah's heart dropped. She tried to undo the lock, her fingers trembling, but it was too late. Dee's rage had taken over, and the driver she had trusted had turned into something else entirely. With a sudden lurch, Dee swerved the car harder, pulling it down a dark, deserted road, his grip still tight on her phone. He was in control now. Dee's hands were shaking as he pulled the car to a stop in front of the dilapidated warehouse. The building loomed in the darkness, a cold, empty shell that had seen better days. The tires screeched against the cracked pavement, and the engine hummed to a stop. Inside the car, Shaniyah's breath was shallow, her body limp in the passenger seat. Blood from the earlier struggle stained her clothes, and her once vibrant face was marked with bruises. Her eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and fear as she struggled to regain her composure, but she was too weak to escape. Dee opened the door and roughly dragged her out of the car. Her body slumped against him, barely conscious, her legs buckling as he hauled her toward the entrance of the warehouse. "Shaniyah," her face contorted in pain, tried to fight back with the last bit of strength she had left, but Dee was too strong. Her limbs felt heavy, like they no longer belonged to her, and every movement she made felt like it took all her remaining energy. It was cold, the silence punctuated only by the sound of her ragged breaths and the echoing footsteps of her captor. Inside, the shadows seemed to swallow them whole. The warehouse smelled of old machinery, metal, and decay, a stark contrast to the life she had once lived. Dee shoved her against one of the rusted columns, her head hitting the cold, hard metal with a sickening thud. She moaned, her vision swimming, but she refused to go down without a fight. Her eyes, though blurry, burned with hatred. The last thing she wanted was to give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken, defeated. She gritted her teeth, glaring up at him with everything she had left, despite the terror clawing at her insides. "You think I'm just gonna let you do this to me?" Shaniyah managed to spit out, her voice weak but defiant. "You think I'm scared of you?" Dee's chest heaved as he stood over her, the anger in his veins pushing him further into madness. The rejection. The humiliation. Dee grabbed a rusted pipe that lay discarded on the cold concrete floor, its surface rough and jagged. He lifted it in his hands, feeling its weight, its promise of destruction. His heart pounded in his chest as his grip tightened. He could hear his breath in his ears, his vision narrowing to the girl in front of him. With one swift movement, he swung the pipe down, the cold metal connecting with her skull with a sickening crack. Her body jerked violently, but she couldn't escape. He swung again, and again, the blows relentless, each strike driven by the anger and pain he had carried for years. He could feel her body go limp in his hands, but still, he didn't stop. He wanted to hear her beg. He wanted to see her break. Her blood pooled beneath her, staining the cold concrete floor in a dark, spreading river. Her life drained away with each strike, her body growing colder and weaker. The fight had gone out of her, but Dee didn't care. He wasn't finished. Not yet. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Dee stepped back, his breathing ragged, the pipe still gripped in his hands. He stood over her lifeless body, his chest rising and falling in violent rhythm. The blood was everywhere, a gruesome reminder of what he had just done. The woman who had rejected him, the woman who had made him feel invisible, was gone. But as he stared at her, lying in a pool of blood, something shifted in his mind. The adrenaline started to wear off, and with it came the realization of what he had just done. He looked down at his hands, coated in her blood, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his actions. The enormity of what had just happened hit him all at once. He took a step back, staring down at her body, the blood still seeping into the cracks in the concrete. Panic gripped him as the reality of the situation settled in. He had to leave. He couldn't be caught here. The blood on his hands, the broken body in front of him, it was all too much. He turned on his heel and fled, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous, empty warehouse. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. What he had done was done. And soon, the world would know. The news of Shaniyah's disappearance hit the media like a bombshell. Within hours, her face was plastered across social media, her family's frantic pleas for help gaining traction. Fans, friends, and loved ones flooded the internet with messages of hope, all while the dark reality began to settle in. Shaniyah, the young dancer and influencer who had captivated so many, was gone. Her last known moments were tied to an Uber ride, a seemingly innocent decision that would unknowingly set the stage for her tragic end. The investigation quickly zeroed in on the Uber driver, Damarcus D. Holloway. Authorities traced Shaniyah's last known location to the car she had entered that fateful night. At first, it seemed like he might be a simple part of the puzzle, just another driver who had unknowingly become part of the mystery. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that Dee had more to hide than anyone could have anticipated. Surveillance footage near the club where Shaniyah had performed before her disappearance showed Dee's face clearly, his license plate visible in the frame. The footage was damning, there was no denying that Dee had been the last person to see Shaniyah alive. But it didn't stop there. The forensic investigation quickly turned up disturbing evidence. DNA traces were found in his car, clear signs that something violent had taken place in the back seat of his vehicle. And when the police searched his car further, they discovered a bloody garbage bag in the trunk, the contents of which sealed his fate. It was a horrific confirmation of what everyone had feared. As the details of the case unfolded, public outrage grew, fueled by the ever-growing media coverage. The narrative of the troubled Uber driver, a man with a dark history and an unsettling past, quickly took hold. The case sparked fierce debates about the hidden dangers of rideshare services. People began to question the safety of everyday interactions that had once seemed so ordinary. Was it safe to get into an Uber anymore? How much did rideshare companies really vet their drivers? These questions plagued the public as the story of Shaniyah's tragic fate spread. Dee's past, filled with rejection and bitterness, became a focal point of the media coverage. There were stories of his failed relationships, his resentment toward women, his feelings of invisibility. But for every person who tried to understand the man behind the crime, there were others who saw only a predator, a man who had calculated his every move and, when given the chance, had taken the life of an innocent woman without hesitation. In the days following Shaniyah's death, the media turned into a firestorm, each new revelation sparking more outrage, more questions. Dee's arrest was just the beginning of a public reckoning that would eventually lay bare the complexities of his crime and the systemic issues that allowed it to happen. The search for justice moved quickly after the evidence against Dee Holloway became irrefutable. Police tracked him to his mother's house in Decatur, where he had been hiding since the murder. The moment they arrived, Dee knew his time was up. As the officers approached, he attempted to flee, running from the inevitable confrontation. But the law caught up with him, and he was tackled to the ground, screaming in desperation, "I didn't do nothing." His frantic pleas echoed in the quiet night, but no one was fooled. The evidence was too strong, the case too clear. Dee Holloway had murdered Shaniyah Porter, and he was going to pay for it. In the weeks that followed, the legal process began to unfold. The courtroom was filled with tense anticipation as Dee's trial commenced. The evidence against him was overwhelming, yet it wasn't just the facts that made this case so chilling, it was the dark glimpse into Dee's psyche that would come to light during the trial. As his defense team scrambled to create some semblance of a case, they couldn't hide the truth about Dee's deep-seated misogyny. His violent tendencies, buried beneath layers of self-pity and resentment, were laid bare for all to see. The jury, the media, and the public all bore witness to the ugliness of a man whose hatred had festered for years, until it finally exploded in a savage act of violence. But it wasn't just Dee's rage that haunted the courtroom, it was the grief of Shaniyah's mother. Her tearful testimony, filled with heartbreak and disbelief, broke the silence that had hung over the proceedings. She spoke of her daughter's dreams, her joy, and the future that had been stolen from her in an instant. The raw emotion of her words left no one in the room unaffected. It was a mother's agony, a pain that would never be fully healed, and it brought the reality of Shaniyah's murder into sharp focus. Her mother's voice cracked as she spoke of the girl she had raised, the girl who had once filled her house with laughter and love, now reduced to a memory and a victim of unspeakable violence. As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of the case was undeniable. The prosecution presented their final arguments, painting a vivid picture of Dee as a man whose misogynistic views and violent tendencies led him down a path of no return. His actions were not those of a man driven by some momentary lapse in judgment, but of someone who had harbored hatred for women for years, waiting for the right moment to act on his twisted impulses. The defense tried to argue his troubled past, his history of rejection, and his difficult upbringing, but it was clear that these were not excuses, they were explanations that did nothing to mitigate the horrors he had inflicted. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict, guilty on all counts. Dee Holloway, the man who had once been a quiet, unassuming Uber driver, was now a convicted murderer. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension, erupted into a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but it was a hollow victory. Shaniyah was gone, and nothing would ever bring her back. The sentencing phase of the trial was equally swift. The judge, visibly disgusted by the brutality of the crime and the coldness with which Dee had carried it out, handed down the sentence without hesitation. Dee Holloway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no second chances, no appeals, no way for him to ever walk free again. His fate was sealed, and the community could finally begin to heal from the horrors he had inflicted. But for Shaniyah's family, the sentence was not enough. Nothing could erase the pain of their loss. Shaniyah's mother would have to live the rest of her life without the daughter she had loved so dearly, a void that would never be filled. The justice system had done its job, but the price of that justice was the life of a young woman with so much potential, so much promise, taken far too soon. As Dee Holloway was led away in shackles, the weight of his actions hung heavily in the air, a grim reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lie hidden in the most unexpected places. This tragic story serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences that can unfold when individuals are overlooked, and their safety is taken for granted. Shaniyah Porter's untimely death, at the hands of someone who was supposed to be a trusted figure, is a heart-wrenching example of how vulnerability can be exploited when proper precautions are not in place. As we reflect on this tragedy, we're left wondering if there were signs that could have been recognized sooner, or if systems in place could have prevented this senseless loss. It raises the crucial question: could this tragedy have been avoided if warning signs had been noticed earlier? How can we ensure better safety measures for those who rely on rideshare services? If this story shocked you, like and subscribe for more cases that explore the darkest intersections of trust, violence, and betrayal.